Well, hello everybody, and welcome back. My name is John, and I'm just jacked to be back. Sorry for the week break, but life gets in the way of you guys and also the instructors sometimes. So thanks for your patience. I'm joined tonight by my wingman, Mike Horn. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing good, John. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Always good to see you. And our guest facilitator tonight is Jerry Jackson. Jerry's going to be chiming in here or there. He's got both internet problems, and I think he's got a baby on his lap tonight. He's got dad duty, so he is on audio. He might join us on video later. How you doing, Jerry?
I'm doing excellent. Always a great day.
Yeah, it was a great day. So thanks for joining us, Jerry. We're really excited about your contribution tonight. So speaking of that, this is module two of a three-module program, and let's get right into it. So tonight is all about something called due diligence. And due diligence is one of those topics people cringe when they hear the words, and usually because there's a lot of work involved, and everybody has a different definition of what kind of due diligence is. There's no set procedure for due diligence, but there's a lot of common activities. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight mainly. We're going to talk about the common tasks that are involved in most due diligence activities, really because these things we do during due diligence are going to impact what price we're willing to pay if we're the buyer. And if we're the seller, we need to be conscious of those things that any buyer is going to check that might put our valuation or asking price at risk. So, we believe it's both important for buyers and sellers to understand what the issues are and what happens during due diligence. It's one thing to have third party reports and valuation reports and proud of how valuable your company is, but once people open the hood and get in there, sometimes that valuation price doesn't necessarily stick. So as a seller, we need to understand what to expect. And as a buyer, we need to understand what are those things we should be looking at. We're going to talk about the other things you see on the list. I'm not going to read the slides here. We're going to get right into it. We're also going to talk about starting to think about a funding strategy, particularly what types of things banks look for, how banks think in terms of looking at a loan for a purchase of a business. And we have to know how they think and what they look for so that we can factor that in if we're the buyer, because we have to figure that out and model that to see A, if we can afford it as a buyer, and B, if it's even doable in the bank size. Doesn't matter what the seller is willing to sell it for and what we're willing to buy it for, but if the bank, and we're relying on a bank to support it, it's got to be bankable as well. So we're going to talk about that. And really, all this goes into what we're going to talk about next week, which is the definitive purchase and sale agreement and what usually goes into that. But due diligence is probably the most important part of the process and really shapes the final deal. But before I go on, Mike, did I miss anything?
You didn't miss anything, but I did want to add something, John, that, and you mentioned it early on, that there's no set pathway or due diligence uh, list or anything, but due diligence can really vary a lot depending on the company that you're buying, obviously. There may be a whole bunch of stuff that can come with it. There may not be a bunch of stuff that comes with it. And so it's really going to vary on how much effort goes into due diligence. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. And on your interface and your resources, we've provided a sample due diligence list. It isn't exhaustive, but it has a lot of common things on it, and we'll touch on some of those. But that's a good takeaway for you listening to this tonight. Also, we're going to touch on the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office later and SBA lender match, and we want you to have those links as well as a copy of the slides that you have for tonight as well. So without any further ado, let's open it up with some questions. Now, if you're in the audience, you can feel free to chime in, but this is where our guest facilitator is going to provide some expertise along these questions, but feel free to participate in the group chat box as you see fit, guys. First question is, both from the sellers and buyers perspective for each of these questions, but Jerry, maybe you can chime in on this. If you're the seller, what are some of the ways to prepare the business for sale? Now, before we answer that, Jerry, I'm going to open the door for you. Can you just take a few minutes? Tell us about yourself, what you do for a living, what you did before, and kind of set the stage for who you are so people understand the angle from which you're answering these questions.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm a retired Green Beret. Got my MBA right before I retired. Did a bunch of sales things, and then got introduced to the entire ETA process, and began my own self-funded search for about 2 years. I'm actually about to close on my first here in about 2 to 3 weeks. So pretty excited about that, and I've got a lot of lessons learned, both from the search and from the business I'm going to close on now. About 6, 7 months ago, I was talking with a broker, and he needed some help with some of the larger transactions, and so I started working as a business broker and M&A advisor with him. So I get to, after spending over a year and a half on the search side of things and looking at it from the buyer perspective, now I'm on it from the broker side of things, kind of seeing both buyers and sellers, right? So that gives me a lot of kind of unique perspectives that some others might not have. And then kind of around that same time, about 6 months ago, I started an internship program for folks their last 6 months in the military that are getting out of that are in special operations that want to learn about ETA and want to acquire their own business. I set that up to be able to teach them about it and help them along the path there and provide them all the resources that they need. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from.
That's great, Jerry. Thanks for that. So, with that kind of background, what's your perspective on this first question? Like, from the seller's perspective, now that you're on the seller side in many cases, as you described as a broker, it's like, what are some of the ways sellers prepare their businesses for sale and some of the things that they could do ahead of time that you've seen, or that you recommend?
Yeah, and this is where the somebody working with a broker really comes in play, and hopefully they've got a good broker on their side that has helped prepare them along the way. Because oftentimes, you find a lot of these smaller businesses, they might not have a good handle on all their financials, or they're not as sophisticated and don't have a lot of great systems. They're just focused on hey, they're in their business and running it and making things happen. So, one of the biggest things to unravel oftentimes is the financials of it and getting all the documentation that they need ready, for a potential buyer that's going to be doing a Q of E. Um, and I've even seen to where, hey, if you can, hire a fractional CEO to kind of, or CFO to help unravel and document a lot of those things, especially when it comes to things like ad backs, right? And those are always a contentious kind of piece where, depending on, what the broker has done as far as managing expectations, sellers may expect that, hey, all these other expenses, they're going to count, towards, a seller's discretionary earnings or an adjusted EBITDA. But that's where the brokers really need to be able to help manage the expectations and approach it from a buyer's standpoint or an SBA lender standpoint. If it's a business that might go the SBA route, hey, what is going to count for an ad back? How much of that is going to count for an ad back? And then it's if you just have an Excel spreadsheet or a P&L, that's not going to be sufficient. A bank is going to want to see bank transactions, W-2s, and any type of actual official documentation. And I only say that because I've had a couple businesses that I've been working with now, and also the transaction I'm closing on right now, where hey, we're trying to get all these things together to be able to show what the actual cash flow is of the business. And while the Q of E that we did, is doing their thing, the lender's not going to depend on the Q of E. They might look at it to help kind of back up their own thing, but they're doing their own underwriting, right? And so the only thing that they're going to count is anything that they got hard, fast documentation on. And so that's what's going to count towards that DSCR if you're looking at, an SBA loan type deal. So I kind of went down a few different rabbit holes there, but essentially the number one thing that I can stress for sellers in preparing their business is getting documentation in order for their financials, and then working with a broker that knows what they're doing, and then even bringing in a highly qualified CPA or a fractional CFO to help out with that.
All good stuff. And I think I wrote down here, you brought up several acronyms, and I want to make a point about that. As a seller, even though we might have run our business forever, some of these concepts that you threw out in acronyms are sometimes the first time we've ever heard of them as sellers. So it's important to know what's coming from and what's important, as you said, from a banker's perspective and everything. And my favorite is Q of E. Uh, I had an MBA too before I started my company. When I went to sell, I'd never heard that term before, and a private equity firm was buying us, and they're from Canada. So a private equity firm from Canada, they said we're going to do a Q of E, and they weren't, and with a French accent. And I said, I'm thinking Canada, aren't they? Don't they have the Queen of England part of their currency or something? I thought it was Queen of England something, but and I'm making fun of myself because I that was my first thought. And I had never heard of a Q of E, even though we had, it was a C Corp with investors and I had done audits and everything. My point is, using myself as a dumb example, a lot of sellers, we don't know what a lot of these concepts are. Add backs, um, sellers' discretionary earnings, as common as those terms might be to a lot of people listening to this right now. When we go to sell our business, if we've been focused on our business for a gazillion years and now it's time to sell, we haven't been thinking about that stuff, nor have we heard about it. So I appreciate you bringing it up. Mike, anything to add to that?
No, it's all good. Thank you, John.
Gary, any comments there?
Nope, that's pretty good.
All right. Well, Jerry, how about like from the buyer's perspective? What are some of the ways, I'll put your buyer hat on, um, do good buyers like approach the same thing from the different side? What are some ways they can prepare themselves to be a viable buyer to a seller? Like, I'm sure sellers don't want to waste their time with buyers that are never going to make it through due diligence. What are some of the things you've seen that make a good buyer candidate a good buyer candidate?
Yeah, absolutely. Not especially since I'm on both sides of the coin now. Number one thing by far is really convincing both any parties that are involved from the initial contact on, can you close the deal, and can you do what you say you can do, and being able to provide that confidence to every party involved that you know what you're doing. You've got your team in place, you've got a plan, and you can close. Because at the end of the day, deals fall apart. Nobody wants a broken deal, and it just creates chaos. So, really, even from the seller's perspective and the broker's perspective, that's their number one thing that they're looking for is like, hey, can this guy actually close? And I can give you a couple examples. I've got a company right now, a seller. Unfortunately for him, he was working with somebody that didn't know what they were doing, had a huge exclusivity period where, hey, they couldn't go out and shop things afterward. It was like 9 months or something like that, and the buyer couldn't close. So for 9 months, this guy couldn't do anything else with his business, and he was expecting it to sell really quickly, and it didn't because the buyers couldn't close. And now, so he's in a spot where he's kind of let things slide a little bit, and he's like, making significant concessions to try to sell it as fast as possible now. And then even with the deal that I have and I'm about to close on, I wasn't the original person that they selected. They went with somebody that said hey, they had all cash and they were offering well over asking and they could close quickly. 3 months later, due diligence, complete. They met with, they did all of the process, get to the closing table, and they don't have the cash. And so now the buyer, has to do everything from scratch. And one of the key people is looking at possibly quitting now. And then the people that they work for, their customer base, they're a little shaky on some things, and they've got like some renewable contracts. I'm like, well, hey, is this going to go forward? So it just creates a lot of issues. So obviously, sellers and brokers and anybody involved in that transaction, they want to know that you can close the deal. And how do you do that? There's several ways that you can do that, right? If you're looking at the typical search fund model and you're using SBA, and whatnot. You have a separate entity already established. You've got a white paper and a presentation and a website, outlining who you are, what your criteria is looking for, what your experience is, what kind of team you might have backing you up. If have an idea of what your deal team might look like. If you have investors, who they might be, have your personal financial statement, your PFS already ready to go. And if you're going to be working with an SBA lender, have some type of letter of support with them. And then what I would do on when I was talking with brokers, right? I knew what my process was. I said, hey, this is what I'm looking for. Specifically, this is what my plan. I plan to close in this amount of time, and this is explain how you're going to actually go about closing that deal and how serious you are with that. And I would lead with these. And I wouldn't, if I'm looking at something on BizBuy, I wouldn't necessarily click on the, hey, send me more generic information, right? I'd call the broker up. I'd contact them personally. Like, hey, I'd tell them all the same things. I try to develop that relationship if I hadn't already made contact with them. And I would lead before they ask me, for all my other stuff, because they're gonna want to build a buyer profile for you. They're gonna want you to sign an NDA, and if you as soon as they reach out and you lead with, hey, here's my bio, here's my website, here's my PFS, my letter of support from banking, here's how I'm gonna fund the deal, and this is what my plan on all these things. Like, okay, wow, this guy's already got his stuff together. He knows what he's doing. And then the next step would be clear and quick communication, being able to evaluate a deal quickly and provide feedback and say, hey, no, you're going to pass on it and then provide feedback for whatever reasons. And then being able to do that quickly so they're not like following up on you. That helps build that confidence that, one, you know what you're doing. Two, you can sift through stuff really quickly, and that you mean business when it comes to trying to close quickly or not.
Yeah, all good stuff. So clearly, there's a difference between like the sellers and buyers and what they're preparing for before they engage with each other, which was the point with these questions. So you articulated that very well. Mike, anything to add there?
Well, I guess the only thing I'd add is that it's very frustrating from a seller perspective when you have tire kickers come in and folks that are not qualified, as Jerry just mentioned, and don't have their shit together, and you waste time talking to these people. And the key is exactly what Jerry mentioned. You've got to establish a personal relationship between the buyer and the seller, particularly if you're going to ask for seller financing. You've got to make sure that you've got a good, solid relationship going on there. And all of that documentation that Jerry went through there is super important, particularly when you're talking about seller financing. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. Good stuff. Thanks, Jerry.
I'll take that one little step further as far as the fit, right? You want having a good fit with the owner is huge, because you get some of these deals and they have multiple offers on the table, and they might not go with the largest one. The deal I'm closing on right now, I actually told them, I'm like, hey, you might want to go with PE, private equity, or somebody else that can afford to pay more. And they ultimately went with me only because I was a good fit, and our values aligned on some things, and that also goes with that professional appearance and how you presented yourself from day one, that very first correspondence, and so that you're building that bank account, so to speak, of credibility, for when hey, they do have to make a decision. Do I go with this guy or go with this guy? And that's gonna pay dividends.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good point. And at the end of the day, a transaction is really between at least two different people, the buyer and the seller, clearly. But it comes down to, how does the seller feel about who they're handing the keys to? Do they care or not?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If they don't care, they want the who's going to pay the most. If they do care, a lot of other things come into play, as you alluded to. So that's absolutely real world stuff right there. Thanks for that. Well, Mike, did you have something to add?
No, we're good. Thank you, John.
Okay. So one of the things we need to do before we go into due diligence is assemble a team. Due diligence is not a one-man sport here. It is a team effort, and typically we want to have at least a few of these kind of people in every deal. So we want somebody that can really look at numbers. Usually the ultimate there is a CPA. So if you know a CPA, they're the ones to bring in. They might do it for free. A lot of people that are friends with CPAs can get that benefit. But if not, we should really think about paying a CPA to help us look at all the different financial statements that are so important. Clearly, an attorney is needed. Um, and there's all different kinds of attorneys, and they all have different approaches to how much to put in agreements. And lawyers think differently. They're not good or bad. I'm just saying they think differently, and oftentimes, sometimes things get too complicated on purpose with some lawyers. Other lawyers like to keep things real simple. So you got to be careful on who you recruit as a lawyer, because a lawyer can actually botch up a deal on one hand or make a deal happen on the other. So it absolutely is critical who your lawyer is on your team. And then this one isn't really talked about too much, but we believe strongly in it, particularly if you're a veteran, is find other trusted business owners to create like a little advisory board for yourself. People that are like you. So say you're a veteran buyer, you want to maybe get some other veterans that own businesses or that have sold businesses or that have bought businesses to be like your impromptu advisory board. And those people have already gone through the process. So they sometimes they're among your best advisors because they've had to deal with all these different personalities, the banks, the lawyers, the CPAs, the sellers, and they've succeeded to some degree. So you want to kind of lean on them as well. There's some other ones involved as well. And, you know, an investment banker, somebody on your team that can advise you on financing strategies. So sometimes we need that, because if we don't know how we're going to pay for this purchase, oftentimes we need somebody on the team that knows how to get the financing in place. And that's usually an investment banker type of person. Um, and or if you've got established relationships with banks and investors, we might want to involve them as early as possible into the deal. So step one in the due diligence as the buyer oftentimes is assembling a team. And without a good team, uh, the quality of the due diligence just isn't going to be there. Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you 100%. And I would say that, if you're going to present the seller with your personal financial statement and a letter from the bank, you need to already have a solid relationship with the banker. And that just is, it's critical to closing the deal and establishing that trusting relationship that Jerry was talking about, because once people like bankers get involved, that makes everyone understand that it's really serious, and we're really proceeding down the path to make the deal close. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. Jerry, anything to add to this slide?
Nothing here.
All right. All right, so we've seen this slide before, just to kind of level set everybody. Basically a four-step process. The letter of intent usually is a non-binding letter of intent, and that's the first step in the process. Company is selling for X price. You provide a letter of intent that includes what you're willing to pay. Could be X minus, or could be X plus in some cases. So that's all including a letter of intent, usually an exclusivity period involved there, so you can conduct due diligence without wasting your time. They can't shop it around. And conversely, if you're the seller, you're committing to giving this buyer an exclusive period of time where only they are going to have the opportunity to buy your business. So that's kind of step one. We kind of covered that a lot last week. So what we're talking about due diligence, the due diligence step. And then that's followed by the purchase and sale agreement, which we'll talk about next week, and some of the things to put into that and finalizing the deal, and then a transition period thereafter. But what we're talking about is due diligence. And I'm going to say something, Jerry, make sure you're on mute because as a broker, you might scream. But this is like real world stuff, which we like to communicate at the CEO programs. And lots of other people say this too, but oftentimes there's a school of thought that the letter of intent, sometimes we get too wrapped up in step one. I'm dealing with somebody right now, and the price offered is usually through a confidential information memorandum, or it's on biz by sell. And we have no idea what that business is about yet because we haven't done due diligence. And we say that business isn't worth X. And we get all wrapped up around the selling price and evaluation. And personally speaking, and my panelists might disagree, there's a school of thought that I subscribe to that says, whatever the price is, if you think it's in the ballpark, agree to it in the letter of intent. It's non-binding. And if it's something you're willing to pay, that's not the time to haggle over the price because you might not
Right.
never make it to due diligence. And
Right.
I'd like to kind of go around the room here and get some opinion on that. Starting with you, Jerry, what do you think about that approach if you're the buyer?
Yeah, I almost need a couple moments to even think about that. But I mean, I don't disagree with it at all. The only thing is from the seller standpoint, they're going to be anchored to that. Now, there's a lot that comes out in due diligence where you have to adjust things, and that's where it's important to have those conversations. And you can say, and that's also where the broker comes into play and being able to manage expectations on some things. As far as hey, what kind of things can come out in due diligence. That's why we do due diligence, because you might find things aren't what they were made out to be. All the ad backs might not count towards the income that's required to meet a debt service coverage ratio, for example. Or you start getting into working capital and cash conversion cycles and realize, oh, hey, instead of 500,000 in working capital, we actually need 1.4. That's literally what happened with my deal. And so we had
Yeah.
to actually redo a lot of things where the seller wasn't happy about it. But at the end of the day, hey, that's what's necessary to close the deal. Thankfully, working with a great broker that has a good relationship with the seller and has done well to manage expectations. So that being said, like, yeah, no, I agree. Getting it under LOI and doing what you need to, with all, within, you know, reason and integrity, right, to get it wrapped up under LOI. That way you can get into due diligence. I think is a priority.
Yeah, good stuff. Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with what Jerry just said there. I'd also say that I think it's important. Um, well, first, let me say that in my experience, most business owners overvalue their company because it's their baby. And maybe it's just many business owners, but a lot of business owners overvalue their company. And one of the things that I have always thought is important is not calling someone's baby ugly. And in the letter of intent, if you try and lowball them in the letter of intent, that's like calling their baby ugly. And that, in my opinion, again, does not help establish that relationship between the buyer and the seller. And I think that's what the important part of getting past the letter of intent and getting to the due diligence is. You have to establish a relationship with the seller, between the seller and the buyer, so that you can even move toward due diligence. So I'm with you on that, John. I think that there are a lot of things that can turn up during the due diligence that can change the price point in the letter of intent. Thank you, John.
Yeah, and another couple of things related to that. Thanks, Mike and Jerry. Due diligence usually takes at least 30 days, but can take up to a year, depending on it. So the due diligence process takes a life of its own on. We end up getting so many people involved on both sides, the sellers and the buyers, and really qualified people, attorneys, lawyers, CPAs. So it's not just between two people arguing about price. It's a lot of professionals that know what they're talking about, all looking at the information and coming to some common ground on whether the value should stick or come down or go up, right? And it's no different than when we buy something in our personal lives, and maybe we buy a car or something, a used car, and we walk away laughing, saying, "I can't believe they were only asking X for this. I've looked at 10 other ones and they're all $5,000 more. We got a great deal." Buying a business is somewhat similar. Sometimes you go through due diligence and you're like, "Wow, this is a heck of a deal. Like this thing's going to pay for itself in 2 years. Like let's get to the purchase and sale agreement as quickly as possible." So hopefully that's the outcome you have as the buyer. So due diligence is again a long process, takes a life of its own, has a lot of people involved, and is usually the process by which common sense will take over and a deal will happen, or not, right? And that's the important part of due diligence. Any thoughts from my colleagues on that before we move on?
That is so true. Thank you, John.
Again,
The
this
only
is a
thing I
deeper
would
look.
add,
Go ahead, Jerry.
I was going to say the only thing I would add is, and maybe you covered this in the LOI phase last time, but that's exact. All of these points are exactly why you should go with an LOI. There's some excuse me. There's some schools of thought and some brokers that come from the real estate side of things that try to push a purchase agreement immediately, and for numerous reasons that you may have already discussed, that's not a good idea.
Yeah, that's like buying a house and then you haven't even looked at it yet, right? It's full of termites.
Right.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So I've actually had some people come to me and say, "Hey, the buyer really wants me to sign a binding letter of intent." Um, in my opinion, that's another no-no, right? Relating to what you're saying, which usually includes the price. Um, and So one last point, and then we'll get to this slide. As a seller, one of the cool things is knowing this ahead of time. And if you're taking this program because you're a potential seller, this is good to know. Having squeaky clean stuff ready for due diligence and knowing what everybody's going to look at gets you three-quarters of the way there to get the price you want. And
Right.
and one of the things I'm glad I did when I ran my company for 17 years. Almost every day, I was always ready for a call for somebody wanting to buy the business. I had all my information, and we always kept all the material that typically would be involved in the due diligence, like really fresh and up to date, and really always be ready for a due diligence process. And many times, people like, "Oh crap, I got to come up with all this stuff," and they have to create it as the seller to satisfy the buyer. And just from an operational perspective, best practices to always be ready to answer any due diligence questions is just running a good business. It's nothing really unique you have to create during due diligence that you shouldn't have already if you're running the company well. Any thoughts on
Mhm.
that, guys? Okay.
Go ahead, Jerry.
This Gary, you're on mute if you had something to say.
I'm good.
Okay. One other This is a deeper look at the process. The only thing I want to mention is we're talking about the top item on the second stage, but there's a lot of stuff around financing that's involved during the due diligence phase. We're going to touch on it tonight, but as you can see, there's a lot of stuff we have to do in addition to just looking at the company to get our dollars lined up, either through investors or banks or a combination of both. And it's alluded to on the slide, but uh, we don't have enough time, or we don't want to make this too robust of a program, but just know that we're talking about standard stuff, really at one item of many in the due diligence process. Um, so what is due diligence, right? Well, it's a number of things. Like, again, there's no set standard for due diligence, according to the SEC, includes these 52 items, right? There's no such defined regulatory requirement. And first of all, clearly one of the most important things has to do with the financial aspects of the business. So what we want to look at, historical financials. What's the quality of the historical financials? Um, do the historical financials match the tax returns? do the do the bank statements have nothing but business stuff in them, or are they intermingled with personal stuff? Do the bank statements match the cash balances on the financial statements? These are all the things like a good CPA will look at, and clearly a Q of E would look at. We'll talk about Q of E later, but the financials have to make sense and kind of triangulate and cross-check each other in terms of tax reports, bank statements, and financial statements. Customer lists is another one. So who are your customers? Do you have 5 customers or 500 customers? Is 80% of your business tied up in 2 out of 50 customers? That's a customer concentration problem. That is very risky, or not, right? Or is all your revenue spread evenly across many, many customers? That would be better, right? So that's an important thing. Who's in the company? Who's a W-2 employee? Who's a key person you can't afford to lose? A lot of times, key salespeople are very, very important. Operations people, stuff like that, and we need to understand who that is. How many of them are contractors? How many of them are, come from suppliers or third parties? These are all things we're going to want to know as the buyer, and as the seller, we want to have a good story around who your HR people are and what keeps the place running and how does that look. Clearly, assets and inventory of those assets are going to have to be looked at. What's the quality of the inventory? If there's $500,000 worth of X product on the shelf, does it have a shelf life, and is half of it expired? For example, like what's the quality of the inventory, and what's the value of it on the balance sheet? Does that check out? Clearly, we're going to want to look at contracts. Are the contracts what's called assignable or not? If this is one thing people don't understand on an equity purchase, we talked about an equity purchase versus an asset sale. On an equity purchase, most of the time, contracts do not have to be assigned, because you're basically buying the entity that has the contract with the customer. If we're doing an asset sale, a lot of smarter, larger companies in particular require that if there's a change of control during the contract period, that they have the right to approve the new owner. Basically, there's different language that said it's called assigning a contract. So we want to look at, of the customer contracts, are there any assignment issues in those contracts? Or the day after we buy it, half the customers go, well, we're going to cancel our contract because we can, because we really liked Ralph, and Ralph's not here anymore. So that's a key thing. Supplier and vendor lists, like how strong are those? How dependent is the business on any key supplier or not? What's the health of those suppliers? What do those contracts look like? Are there any assignment-like clauses in those contracts? Clearly, legal issues. Are there any skeletons in the closet? Mike, hold your ears. So are there any legal issues regarding the business that need to be disclosed or not? Were there any in the past that still linger? Are there any HR issues that need to be looked at, or anything that needs to be revealed during that? And then finally, what kind of intellectual property issues, if any, are there? Does the business own a patent? Yes or no? Does the owner of the business own the patent? Yes or no? What are the trademarks? Are they current? When do they expire? Are there any? All those things all are part of due diligence. So these are the big, big pieces of the types of items that we look at in due diligence. And as a seller, we want to know this. And as I said earlier, we want to prepare for this. So we want to have all kinds of information in all these categories already ready to share with a buyer. And that speeds up due diligence, and we shouldn't get pissed off when they ask us for all this stuff. We should just expect it and have it ready. And as the buyer, we should not be afraid to ask these questions, because the questions in these categories are what's going to get you in trouble. And the last thing I'll say, then I'll defer to my colleagues for comment. Again, we're not going to ask for all this during the LOI stage. Like we're not, we can't, we don't have the right to, basically, right? So we have to agree to the purchase price that we're willing to pay, and agree to a period of exclusivity, and agree to go into due diligence. But having gone through this just now, I think we can all see that there's a lot that can happen as we look at all these things that are going to either justify our proposed price or bring it into question. So starting with Jerry, what have I missed, and anything to emphasize here?
Yeah, no, so a lot of great information there. There's so many things that I can add. The biggest thing that I see and value and view in due diligence is, um, identifying, hey, what are all your key facts, right? And you don't make any assumptions, so you can't take anything as an assumption. And so you basically, what are all your key facts? What are the things that you need to verify? Anything that might have an impact on your business, and then you verify all of those things. And especially if it's anything that might be critical towards your business, just you keep digging deep on the questions on there, and really, I can only give like a couple, I guess, generalized examples on my own personal things, just as far as key assumptions. Even from a contract perspective, there was I asked some key questions and found out, hey, it's not an exclusive contract. There's a competitor that's working on the same contract. Um, if you have some employee issues, I found out there were some employee issues because I was asking, those good deep questions about different employees. Due diligence is also a time to, if you can't do it beforehand, but it's also verifying the seller's motivations. And why are they selling the business? If everything that you're getting it into doesn't back up that whole story, then something's off. And so it's really verifying all of those things that what do you know to be true? What do you not know to be true? What are you assuming to be true and need to verify, and really dig deep. And then on some of those things, it's like, hey, you'll dig and ask some questions, and anything that might be a problem, not necessarily to kill the deal, but just so you can mitigate it, post closing. You get to a point where, hey, no matter what, you might decide, at this point, I've got 80% of the information I need. We're going to close on this. Anything beyond that, it's not necessarily, unless it's catastrophic, right? Not necessarily a reason to kill a deal, but like, okay, well, hey, how do we mitigate that and move forward? And maybe there's a way you can work with the seller on those things ahead of time to be able to do that as well. And really, another thing on the assumptions, I can anecdotally tell is, I had looking at working capital and cash conversion. Maybe it's later in the slides, I don't know. But when I'm doing my calculations on things, and I am going to take over the business on X date, and the first invoice that I'm going to file as the new owner, let's say it's 2 weeks after I take over, in my calculations prior to, I was assuming that, hey, I'm going to get that entire invoice. I asked a question to the seller, and the seller was like, well, no, absolutely not. That's work done during my time. So it just creates conflict. So I'm just kind of using that to illustrate, don't assume anything. Really try to tease out and verify anything that you might be assuming.
Great stuff, particularly the seller motivation thing, which we're going to kind of drill into next week. But good stuff, especially the facts and assumptions thing. Mike, anything to add there?
Well, I guess what I'd add, John, is that because I'm a federal government contractor, I'm subject to the Defense Contract Audit Agency or the Defense Contract Management Agency coming into the business anytime and looking at these kinds of things. This is what they look at when DCAA comes in and looks at your business. And so you've got to have your stuff all together all the time, because you never know when they're going to show up. So that's all good, and I'm glad that I do that. The other thing that I'd say is that when you're doing government contracts, um, and there is a change of management or leadership, then all of those contracts have to go to back to the contracting officer, and you have to execute a novation between the buyer and the seller, saying, "Hey, I'm the buyer, and I'm taking over this contract, and I'm the seller, and I'm giving up this contract." And when you're mid contract like that, this goes back to Jerry's point, and partial payment has been made to one bank account, and then you want to change the bank account that the remaining payments go to, that is a complicated issue that you will have to resolve with the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, because all of these moving parts can be like a real pain in the ass when you are a government contractor. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And it's a good example of what comes up in due diligence, and only in due diligence to get into that level of detail, right? And then this is what impacts deal structure, which we'll get into in a minute. How do you offset some risks there once the transaction's done, like the one Jerry brought up as an example, and what you're talking about on one hand, and how do you preserve the purchase price or selling price? All of this is related, and all the details we're talking about kind of feed into the strategy for that. One of the things that one of the most important things we do in due diligence is clearly financial analysis. And there's a school of thought about kind of two techniques to actually check the block on this one. Now, very seldom are the buyers CPAs, or are the buyers, accounting experts. Very seldom, right? We're operators. We're salespeople, we're operators, we understand the industry, but a lot of times we're not like CPA level accounting knowledgeable. So, and conversely, many sellers have relied on CFO or something, or they might have black belts in finance by the time they go to sell it. But they, again, they're a little bit less than smart as they are in a core business. So we have this issue of financial analysis, which is a clear part of due diligence. So there's two schools of thought, and that I'd say over the last 5 to 10 years, Q of E has become the sexy thing, right? So conducting a Q of E, and it's definitely worth doing. I'm not saying it's not. But a Q of E is a quality of earnings report, usually done by a third party CPA firm that does Q of E's, just like they do audits, just like they do reviews. They'll come in and do a Q of E, which is similar to an audit. And they're going to check all the financial statements in detail, much like an audit is performed. And they're going to come back with a nice, good looking report that says, yep, the numbers are good to go, right? We stand by the numbers that the seller has presented. And this is controversial. I want to talk about it for a few minutes and get everyone's opinion. But, on one hand, if you're buying a $10 million company, Q of E might make a lot of sense. However, if you're buying a $10 million company who's at audits for the last 6 years because they've had professional investors on their board that include CPAs and a finance committee on the board, and they've had audits, do you really need to do a Q of A? Is the controversial point. There's a school of thought that says, well, either all those audits have been wastes of time, and those are done by third-party CPAs. The finance committee had no idea what they were doing, and it's all been a lie. So therefore, we need the Q of E. That's kind of what we're saying a lot of times in that scenario. However, if it's a $10 million company, they've never had a board or investors, and it's been the founder running the books, then him or herself the whole time, you might want a Q of E. If you're buying a food truck for $250,000, do we really want to do a Q of E for 10 to 30K just to make sure that the revenue is what it is, right? This is the controversial thing. The alternative, and I'll get back to that with my panelists, the alternative is to just bring in your CPA friend on your team that we mentioned earlier, and they conduct an assessment, right? They look at the tax returns. Does it sync with the financial results? Yes or no? all those things we talked about earlier. Are the bank statements not mingling with personal stuff? What's the quality from their perspective? And if it's shoddy, then we might do a Q of E. If it looks good and it all cross checks, um, and whoever's been running the books is an accountant or a bookkeeper or a CPA, the CPA on your team might say these books are good to go. But I'm going to open it up to Jerry and Mike for some comment. Jerry, what are your thoughts on Q of E's and what we're talking about here?
Yeah, no, those are all some great ideas. I hadn't even thought of the, the $10 million company that has multiple audits and CPAs on there. I think that's a great example of, hey, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you assume you want to do it no matter what. But obviously, something to think about for sure. In general, I'm a fan of them only because, hey, you're putting a PG on the line, $1 million plus on something. You want to make sure, in my mind, you want to make sure that's good. And I've taught, I've listened to some other folks out there that say, they found some, so much just outright fraud on some of the documents. And then the broker that I'm working with right now, as an example, we don't do too much business in South Florida only because the limited uh, uh, transactions that this broker just had down there. They've had multiple where they even had like forged tax returns, and it wasn't until they did like a Q of E on it and found out like this isn't even a real tax return. So things like that. So there's just other things to consider, right? It's just, hey, how much risk, how much trust do you have in the seller? What can you verify yourself? How much confidence do you have in your own ability to look at, if you're looking at something small like a $250,000 purchase price, and you can clearly see, bank statements that support, those financials, and if it all depends, right? There's the MBA answer. It's just like it
Right.
depends on what's the deal structure look like, what's the risk that you evaluate it's going to be. At the end of the day, it's balancing those things, I think.
Yeah, agreed. It's just different variables feed into the decision, I think, is the short summary. Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I certainly agree with what you guys said, but I would also say that there are diamonds in the rough out there, and um, I hesitate dismissing a potential diamond in the rough because they're screwed up like a soup sandwich. They don't have financials. Their bank statements are an abortion. All of the things that you would look for and want to drill down on during due diligence are like a giant nut roll. And again, it goes back to the risk that Jerry was talking about. How much risk are you willing to take related to this purchase price? But there are some great opportunities out there, and just because you find a number of ugly things in due diligence, that may not necessarily be a reason for you to pass on the deal. Thank you, John.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike. And it made me think of something I think you said last week. It's really the value of the business is not so much what it is today. It's what we're going to do with it once we own it, right? And
Yeah.
oftentimes that's really what should drive our risk tolerance. And you're going to take this standalone thing and you're going to put new coat of paint on it, and you're going to bring it to a different direction. I would hope, in most cases, and
Yeah.
it's that kind of back to your diamond in the rough philosophy, right? That's really what we want to kind of bank on.
Mhm.
That's the exciting part, right? Mike, I know this is your favorite topic, but the concept of seller discretionary earnings, or SDE, again, it's another acronym that's used a lot. And again, as a buyer, we're going to want to know what these are. And lots of brokers are really, really good at defining these ahead of time, kind of carving them out because the sellers know they're going to be asked about this. So this is one of those proactive things. It's usually done pretty well, even in the LOI stage. Um, so what that typically involves is the things you see on this slide. So does the vehicle lease a an F-150 truck that the owner happens to use as a personal vehicle. That's an example of that. Does the owner's husband or wife have an Lexus that is the company's that he or she drives as well? And with company use once in a while, this is what happens in real life. So we're going to want to know what those are. It's one of the advantages of owning a business, but we're going to want to carve that stuff out because all that stuff post transaction is going to stop. So that adds more to the bottom line by adding those expenses back in, as well as depreciation and amortization. So you see the formula there for SDE. And what we're trying to get down to is what is the true profitability of the business. Pretty simple concept. Just wanted to touch on it. But Mike or Jerry, any comments there?
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say on that one is if you are working with an SBA lender already, get an understanding of what are they going to look at and count towards those add backs and those seller discretionary earnings, because you take that net profit and add back some of those other things. Especially let's say it's an asset heavy business and they've got a lot of depreciation in there. Well, most lenders, they're not going to count that at 100% because hey, some portion of that it's going to be capex, capital expenditures. You're going to have to put that money into maintaining, replacing equipment and what have you. So maybe they only allocate 75% of that is actually going to count towards your SDE, what they look at for the ratios. So just getting an understanding of what's going to really count and what's bogus and what's not, because what you're going to see on the sim is everything in a perfect world. To include it, I just saw one the other day. It had hundreds of meal transactions in there, and this is all meals. Like, okay, that's all add back. Well, how much of that is you were using that for your construction crews, and how much was that you actually needed to be able to get business that were with potential customers that were there. So there's it's a whole nother gamut that you kind of have to unwind sometimes. And I would almost never take it, completely at face value.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. Never take it at face value. And you really have to drill down on the details in this stuff because it can add up to a significant amount of money. And so it's well worth your time to get your financials recast so that you can take all these things into consideration. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Mike and Jerry. So, leading into the next thing before we shift gears to starting to think about financing, right? Really what we want to do is build a model that looks at the company after we make the deal, right? What are the post-transaction projections? This is what, if you're going to involve a bank loan, they're going to look at. It's not so much what's happened to date. It's doing everything we're talking about, putting the add backs back in there. And as Jerry said, the ones the bank's willing to agree should go back in there, even though the seller says they're legit and the buyer's willing to accept them. At the end of the day, if you're relying on an SBA loan, it matters what the bank thinks most of all, right, when it comes to that stuff. And what we also want to do is model the plan changes, right? If we're going to add a new product line, if we're going to shut down a product line and emphasize another one, whatever it is, right? We want to model those things. But the biggest one is the last check mark here. And a lot of people don't do this, but as a buyer especially, we want to model the financing that we want the bank to agree to. And we want to do that for two reasons. One is we want to do the bank's job. The bank is going to do this. They're going to involve a small army of underwriters before you close the loan. There's like more and more people. It's like a clown car. People just keep getting out, and you don't know how many people that you can fit in that car. Well, getting a bank loan is similar to that as you go through the stages of getting approval, and they are going to do that. They're going to actually model the P&L and the balance sheet and the cash flow statement. They're going to see if you can afford their loan or not on their terms. So what we want to do as buyers, kind of a best practice, is do that for them. Build in the financing. A good CPA can do this with their eyes closed. And you want to show the bank proactively that you can afford to pay back the loan. based on your assumptions about what you're going to do with the business later. Oftentimes, this is a lot of work. Again, this is why you want a CPA involved, but it's the best practice to do that. And the thing that you see below the spreadsheet here, and we're going to talk more about this next week, and this is another nail on the chalkboard controversial point. It really doesn't matter what the initial asking price is, what we're willing to pay for. If we need a bank to be involved, it really only matters that the bank's going to approve the loan. And based on the purchase price in particular, that's going to drive the principal on the loan largely. If we can't produce what's called a 1.2 to 1.5 debt service ratio, the bank is not going to approve the loan, and we're wasting our time as the seller and the buyer. If we're a seller asking too high a price, or a buyer willing to pay too high of a price, it's going to rear its ugly head when we go to model this. The deal to bring that debt service ratio down, we're not going to get the bank loan. So just to summarize, because a lot of people don't know what a debt service ratio is, it is the amount of cash flow that the monthly payments to the bank, right? So what they want to see is EBITDA, that's profitability without depreciation, amortization, interest, and taxes. That needs to be 1.2 to 1.5 more than what the bank payment is. That's a debt service ratio. And at the end of the day, that's what the bank's going to look at largely to approve the loan or not. So we have to back into that. We have to model it for them. We have to know that it's going to meet that hurdle. And if not, we're going to have a hard discussion about the purchase price or the deal structure. So that's why that's important. That's a bit of a mouthful, but the post-transaction projections are one of the main things we're working towards in due diligence as we learn things. And the one thing we're going to take to the bank, literally. Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, you mentioned it early on that typically a CPA can do this in a very short order. So it's key that you get one on board on your team that can handle this, that understands this business, this type of business, this industry, and can go ahead and do these projections so that you can make sure that you've got your numbers all squared away when you're talking to the bank. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. Jerry, anything to add there?
Just a couple little tidbits. I had an Excel spreadsheet, from Live Oak Bank that I used as a basis for a lot of my modeling that I used, and then I combined that with some other ones and made my own adjustments. But having a spreadsheet, where you can just plug in what the deal structure looks like and plug it in, some key aspects from the P&Ls, and then at the bottom, it's going to calculate, what everything that you said as far as what your potential payments look like and what that debt service looks like, and that gives you a strong basis to be able to initially evaluate, hey, is this a good deal or not? Two little pieces that I only recently learned. Some lenders, you put all those financials in there. You look at, well, hey, this is what the net income is after everything, is what the SD is, right? And this is what my payment would look like, for that. And I got a great, debt service coverage ratio of 1.5. Well, then the bank's going to look at, well, hey, what are the projected taxes that are going to come out of that? And if you pay, they calculate all kinds of different things and say, okay, well, hey, if we can get that net income down to this, you're still going to have to pay this much in taxes. And so some lenders will deduct that amount as well and lower your debt services a little bit. And then something to be said on some of these smaller deals, even when you're looking at the debt service coverage ratio, there's also the minimum income that you need as the buyer to be able to cover different things. So let's say, if you personally have 40,000 in expenses, you need to make 100,000 as an owner's salary, to be able to pay for those things, unless you have some kind of other supplemental income. So those kind of things affect that debt service coverage ratio, and some of the what the owner's salary, the new owner's salary, should be in that model.
Yeah, Absolutely good stuff. So while on one hand we're taking out the previous owner's stuff, we have to add our stuff into it, right? And sometimes there's a wash there. But all of it kind of boils into the projections. And as a goal of due diligence is to get enough information and to build these projections and have it be a bankable set of financial projections. And Dan chimed in. Thank you, Dan. Talking about every banker they talked to looked at TTM, which is trailing 12 months revenue, or P&L for past performance. Yeah, I think, Dan, you're absolutely right. Most of them are going to look at the most recent past. They're going to look at, is your revenue level, or is it growing? Is your profitability sustainable? And are you profitable? Where's the trend with profits? All that stuff is important. And most banks would think that anything beyond 12 months ago isn't that as relevant as the trailing 12 months. So thank you for bringing that up. Um, so next set of questions here, Jerry. Really, as we shift gears into the next section, back to this issue of selling price and valuation. Now, speaking from a seller's perspective, let's say one of your clients, a seller, comes to you and say, what are some techniques or some advice you give sellers on working on what that asking price or valuation should be specifically in terms of, what's a price that's going to be bankable, with an SBA loan, particularly when a loan's involved. Any experience with that particular issue?
Yes, and you kind of talked about it earlier. Almost all sellers think their business is worth more than what it is, right? And ultimately, it's worth what the right buyer is going to pay for it. And really, that depends on so many things, and it's obviously a complex machine, right? And no two businesses are the same, and there's so many factors that go into the business valuation, right? And we tell the sellers that, and then some of it's based off of, okay, hey, the financials, right? But it goes into everything on how well is the business run, how sustainable is the business? Do you have like all the recurring revenue things that buyers that are looking for? And then you start looking at comps, right? And how do you look at a comparable piece? Something in the same industry that sold for 5 million is very different than something that might sell for 500,000. They're not going to go for the same multiple of sellers discretionary earnings as an example, right? And everything, even when you're looking at potentially the same purchase price on things, the deal structure might of one comparable might be completely different than another one. One of them might have had a huge seller's note. One of them might have been an all cash deal. One might have been an SBA loan. And then looking at who's the buyer, right? Is it a strategic buyer, somebody that's looking to do a roll up in there, or is it an SBA, a self-funded searcher? They can afford to pay different prices for the same business. And so sometimes you might get somebody that paid less. Sometimes you get somebody that paid more, just because they got multiple arbitrage. Where let's say, hey, their platform company, they have multiple companies, right? And their whole MO is to roll up other companies that are similar, and they're valued at a 10x, and they can acquire a company. It's being on the market for 4x, and they can offer 5 or 6, and they're still making money because that just rolls up into their 10x multiple. There's just so many things that go into creating that value. So bringing it kind of back to what can sellers do? It's really okay. Hey, find a high quality broker, somebody that deals specifically with business valuations and has all the data. Because that's the other thing. It's like most of the information isn't public, right? It's not like buying real estate and all that information is public and all deals are relatively the same. It's very, very complex. So you really need to get a valuation that can take into account all the business factors, all the comparable sales. What is the industry doing right now? You get I've talked to so many brokers that in 2022 you know they were riding the wave of 2021, and huge multiples and just prices were going way up. So people were like just giving in to sellers and just giving, offering whatever, they said they thought their business was worth, and so many businesses that are sitting on the market, they're not selling because they're overvalued. It's kind of playing catch up sometimes. But it's kind of a long-winded answer, but in any
Yeah,
case,
no,
it's
well,
like it's having somebody
I
that
think
can
it's
bring you back down to reality.
yeah. Well, honestly, I'm glad it's long-winded. It's long-winded because it's complicated, right? There's a lot goes into the final price and evaluation. It's one thing to have a company where you got five bidders, all cash, and it goes to an auction. That's great if you're the seller, right? Um, but if you got like no, it's been tumbleweeds for a year and everybody that's looked at the company doesn't value it to what your price you got on it, or you're not getting anybody interested,
Mhm.
maybe you're a little bit too high, right? So it can be all over the board for all those reasons you talked about. Um, I think I'm going to skip this question because I think we beat this one to death over the last few minutes. But the types of things that banks wants to see for bank support, we talked about debt service ratios and all that stuff. But before we move on, Mike, did you have anything to add there?
Well, the only thing I'd add, John, is that you're exactly correct. This is very complex. And I think that the seller, there are lots of things that a seller can do, obviously. And the trust and relationship between the buyer and seller goes a long way if the seller demonstrates that they're doing those things in order to uh, make the selling price bankable. I think that the cooperation of the seller is very important. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. Question came in, Jerry. I don't know if you got a stat on this, but is there any kind of valid statistic out there about the numbers of deals that are all cash, like percentage industry wide? Do you have any stat on that?
I personally don't have a stat on that. And, industry wide, it's so there's no central database on things, right? And that's kind of like the interesting piece on it. Everything's kind of disaggregated on things. I can only tell you what we've seen from our, within Florida and other deals that we've done throughout the country. So yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah, and even on press releases and stuff, rarely does it put deal structure in there. And Dan, in my opinion, you want anecdotal. My experience is the bigger deals a lot of times are all cash. When you have a private equity firm with a gazillion dollars, they can swoop in, put an all cash deal on the table, usually to get a better price. And because it's all cash, sellers love that, right? Um, I think the larger deals, anecdotally, from what I've seen, the higher chances, as weird as that sounds, can be all cash. The smaller deals with smaller buyers, um, anecdotally, don't involve all cash. Uh, but good question. And to Jerry's point, there's no like central database. There's a platform called PitchBook that a lot of the VC private equity firms use. I've used it. Kind of expensive, but you can
Yep.
get some visibility in the deals and crunch numbers. But even in PitchBook, there isn't a level of detail that breaks down how much was cash and all that. So it is difficult to find out. And lastly, there's no regulation that says you got to report that to the government or something that you can run a report on. But anyway, both buyers and sellers need to understand what banks look for if it's going to involve a bank loan, which a lot of these deals that we are talking about will. And a lot of people don't know this, right? The banks look for 5 Cs, and this might be elementary for some of you guys. Um, the capacity to pay it back is what we said about the projections. Can your projections show that um, you can pay it back, yes or no, right? And that's the one that we can check off if we do a good job with those projections, right? Second is skin in the game. If you don't know this, here it is, right? Anybody that owns or is going to own 20% or more of the entity buying the business usually has to provide a personal guarantee, and because of that, the bank likes to see 10 to 20% of the loan amount you're going to have to put into the deal coming from those owners. And now one owner can put all of it in, but the other ones have to deal with personal guarantees as well. So the bank's going to want to see that, even though it's an SBA loan. The SBA doesn't approve the loan, they actually back the bank, not you. So that's what that's talking about. Collateral. This is why businesses that involve real estate are typically easier to do, because you'll get one loan for the property, which you can amortize over a longer period of time. Banks love deals that involve real estate for that reason. And then the business, they'll do a separate loan for, usually. But collateral is what you're borrowing. Do you have something the bank could sell if they have to take over to get their money back? This is where a lot of software companies, for example, have trouble. There's not a lot of collateral. That's the problem I had in my business. So you got to ask yourself that. Character to veterans, this kind of makes our blood boil. Character equals credit report, credit score. And most banks, it's a showstopper if you're below a certain number, like 710, 720, that kind of thing. And little aside here, for those of us that kind of bootstrap our way to, getting to a point where we want to buy a business, our credit score might be in the tank because we've maxed out credit cards and stuff. So as a buyer, we want to be conscious of our credit score clearly if we're going to get a loan. Seller really doesn't care. All they really care about is whether the loan gets approved or not. But as a seller, you're going to want to know how bankable the buyer is. You might not know their credit score, but you need to assess what you think it might be. And then finally, conditions or covenants or terms that the bank is going to put into the loan documents to hold you to your projections and what you said you were going to do. So these are the 5 C's of getting a bank loan. Mike, anything to add there?
The only thing I'd add, John, is that I'm in the manufacturing business. I have big honking pieces of equipment. I have vehicles all over the place. So when that's the situation, you have collateral that the bank can actually look at, and you have titles and paperwork for, and if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in going in, it's a hell of a lot more straightforward than the software business that you were talking about before, John. Thank you, John.
Yeah, good stuff, Mike. Jerry, any last comments there? You're on mute if you're saying something. But anyway, in the interest of time, we'll move on. A couple things about SBA lending. Things to know, like I just said, the SBA does not lend money. If you're a buyer, these are things we need to know. They guarantee a majority of it to the bank, not you. They are still going to come after the buyer personally for the loan amount as much as they can. And whatever they come up short on, that's what they're going to turn around and go to the SBA to get reimbursed for. And this is a lot of unknown things. A lot of people think they hear SBA loan. The SBA does not lend money, and they're not there to back you up. They're there to back the bank up. One good resource for you to know as a buyer is the SBA Lender Match program. There's a link to it in your resource list. So this is a very efficient way to fill out a form, and then SBA lenders will actually raise their hand through the internet if they're interested in talking to you about maybe working your deal. It's a much more efficient way of finding an SBA lender than Googling it and trying to just go to bank to bank to bank. Most times when you use Lender Match, you're going to get a response from banks you've never heard of before. Many top SBA lenders don't have branch offices. That's all they do is SBA lending. Not all of them, but many of them. So SBA Lender Match is a great resource for you if you're a buyer. A couple other things to know. We're just going to mention briefly. It is not illegal to use retirement funds that you might have as a way to come up with your skin in the game or your down payment on a loan, or some cash you got to put into the deal. So there are 2 ways to do that: a self-directed IRA, and there are firms out there like Alto IRA and Guidant Financial are 2 examples that will help you do this. You have to do it legally, and you have to do it in accordance with IRS regulations, and you have to involve a custodian of your investment. And companies like Alto and Guidant serve as the custodian for those funds. And a lot of people don't know that, and they're not thinking about IRA money. for that. Another similar program using 401ks is what's called a ROBS program, Rollover for Business Startups. There are firms that specialize in this as well. And again, if you have a 401k, there's a certain way to set that up that's legal, that you don't pay a penalty on, and you can use retirement funds for that as well. Mike, anything to add before we move on?
No, those are great programs, worth you spending some time to learning about both of them. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. So questions from this is, what are some of the things should a buyer expect if you're the seller? What are some of the things you think a buyer needs to look into? Mike, any perspective on that?
Well, you mentioned it very early on, and that is, you need to take a look at the IRS form 1065 or whatever tax form was filed for the business, and compare that to what the owner is saying. The relationship and verification with the IRS is very important, and it's one of the ways that you can normally verify it. And Jerry scared the crap out of me when he talked about phonied up tax forms. I hadn't heard that one before, but shit, anything's possible now. So you've got to you got to verify everything. That's the bottom line. You've got to verify everything, and you know the buyer. If you have a company that's equipment heavy, should come into the company and make sure you're doing preventive maintenance on all of your equipment. Make sure that the stuff is fully mission capable, because having a bunch of broke dick equipment laying around doesn't do the value of the company any good. John?
Yeah, good stuff, Mike. Absolutely. And again, this is just setting up the final sequence for tonight, is kind of what's some other research we should do as part of due diligence, as a way to find unpleasant surprises later. And these are some common ones we just want to mention because they're real world, right? So a couple other things we definitely want to do in due diligence in today's day and age is we want to go to the Secretary of State's website where the business we're looking at is registered. So you'd be surprised when you look at that. A lot of companies aren't in good standing, or they're inactive for lots of reasons. So we want to just check the block there at the Secretary of State's website that it's in good standing, active company. Believe it or not, people don't check that. We want to Google the owners of the company. We want to look for stuff they're not disclosing, and anybody can do this. Everybody does this, but again, in today's world, this is a must do, right? You might find something that, not that we're fishing for dirt, but you might find something about the person you're buying this from that could actually represent why they're selling, which would be important to know as the buyer, right? You might find out something about the seller that could have some lingering risk that goes along with the company. You never know, right? The company might have done something like Mike's company. One of the trailers might have slammed into a school bus full of nuns, as he likes to talk about, and he's in litigation now. So we want to know all those things. And these are the things that, if there is some shady stuff going on as to why it's being sold, but we can find out that way, right? So easy stuff. I'm sure you all know that to Google it, right? Customer reviews are pretty common these days, so we want to look for those. Another one is to check out the USPTO, which I gave you. We gave you a link for that in the resource list. Go in there and search on the company name. Make sure somebody else doesn't own it. Make sure the company that owns it might have registered as a trademark. We want to know that if it hasn't been disclosed yet. We also want to know if there's any potential name issues out there that we want to know about. And, you know, in this world we live in today, social media accounts are very, very important. So we want to look at social media accounts, good, bad, or indifferent, as to what's going on as more collateral for the company as we do our due diligence. And then So how do we take all these things we learn in due diligence and kind of put them in a box that we can manage in terms of risk, right? Well, these are some ways, and we're going to get into this next week. So there are some legal ways we finalize in the purchase and sale agreement. A good lawyer will help you with this. And one of them is called reps and warrants, right? These are documented statements that both the buyers put in and the sellers put into the purchase and sale agreement, where we're attesting to um, certain things to be true. So Jerry talked about some things we want to make assumptions on. If we're still a little leery about those things, we can have our lawyer put into the purchase and sale agreement specific statements and make the buyer sign them if it's the sellers, or most commonly, we want the seller to attest to these things that we're still not sure of to be true, and those go into the purchase and sale agreement. We want to have something associated with that, which is a list of covenants, right? Those are things that we want to see done before we close, and a lot of those can be dotting I's and crossing T's of things we found in due diligence. My favorite is a holdback. Lots of brokers hate the word holdback. I had a holdback when I sold my company. I had no problem with the holdback that the buyer wanted, and because I knew I had nothing to hide. So most sellers, if you're a seller, if you're squeaky clean, you should not agree to a holdback unless it's a ridiculous period of time. A holdback is a portion of the purchase price that's held in escrow for a period of time, could be 1 year or less, sometimes more, where something happens unexpectedly during that period. There's a pot of money to draw from to make up for that. And that's called a holdback. So that's often a really easy tool to use to cover any lingering risk. Contract assignments, we already talked about. But at the end of the day, folks, the purchase price adjustment is what happens after due diligence when we've gone through everything we've talked about tonight. You're either going to be jacked because you're getting a great deal and you agree to the purchase price that was in the LOI, or you have found 5 things that say, I still want to buy the company because of what I'm going to do with it, but there's no way I'm paying that first price. The structure has to change, or the price has to change, or both. And that's what you put in your final purchase and sale agreement that you negotiate. Mike, anything to add there?
Well, I know this goes without saying, John, but I always like to mention that it's important that we check the Department of Revenue or the Department of Taxation at every level that is associated with the sale: city, county, municipal, state, and the Fed. You don't want to miss anything with those folks. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. Jerry, any final thoughts? I know we're coming down to closure here and we're short on time, but any final thoughts on this?
No, that's really good.
All right, cool. So, folks, just to wrap it up for tonight, 'cause we'd love to end on time. There's a couple of SBA resources we've mentioned before. They're still relevant now. The SBA does a great job creating these little 30-minute modules on what's important. We kind of hit the wave tops in this program. Certainly not everything you need to know to do a deal as a buyer or a seller, but there's one for sellers, one for buyers. So if you're one of those and you care about the other, take it. I would suggest that whether you're a buyer or seller, you go through both of them because you want to know how your counterpart's thinking, and it makes you a better buyer or a seller. And then next week's our final module. We're going to kind of flow into the third step, which is really the purchase and sale agreement and how to think about making the deal happen and some issues there. So I'm going to pass it off first to Jerry for final thoughts, then to you, Mike, to close it out.
All right.
Jerry, closing thoughts?
I do not have any closing thoughts. I'm just, thank you for having me here, and I'm just glad I can help contribute at least a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for your insights, man. I know you're a busy guy, but thanks for making the time. And Jerry's information, by the way, is in the interface. You can contact him. I said that in the beginning, and his bio's there and his contact information is there, as is Mike and I. Our contact information is there. So, Mike, go ahead and close it out.
Well, I just want to add, John, that, being an entrepreneur and being in business is being a lifelong learner. And it's important that all of us take the time to learn and understand all of these concepts, as complex as this crap really is. it's important that we understand it with a certain degree of confidence, because if you understand these things, your chances of making a better deal improve, and that's what it's all about. So thank you, everyone, for your time tonight. You've been a great group. We appreciate it, and we'll see you all next week for the closing the deal module. Thank you all.
Take care.